Hi everybody, and welcome back to another Manhattan's Project. I'm Jenny Allen, Marketing Manager for 10th Magnitude. I'm joined today by Mark Hanson, Cloud Solution Architect, Shannon Kuehn, Cloud Infrastructure Consultant, and Ryan McDonald, Cloud Solution Architect. So today we're going to talk about a very important subject, which is security. So when we typically talk to customers about security, they usually ask the following questions. Is Microsoft secure? How do I implement infrastructure in Azure securely? And what impact is this going to have on my existing security and compliance programs? So the three lovely people sitting next to me today have worked with countless clients to help migrate to the cloud successfully and securely. So let's get started. All right, Mark. So first things first, how would you summarize the security focus of Microsoft as well as Azure, their cloud platform?
Sure. Microsoft has been incorporating a lot of their security across the board these last few years and inserting it directly into their products and platforms and services that they offer. So it's becoming part of their culture. It's becoming part of everything that everybody across the organization does, and very much the same is the case here at 10th Magnitude. So they've adopted this concept, which many have, about shared responsibility, and started to develop their program, their security program around that. They've spent billions of dollars in the last few years to enhance security programs and a lot of the capabilities they have. They've developed centers such as the Cyber Defense Operations Center, which has numerous different analysts and experts a part of it, as well as the Digital Crimes Unit, which is one of the very few offensive-based security organizations that exist out there. Very, very interesting units that they've created. They have a wealth of material through their different portals that they have to provide a lot of transparency and information, and they're obviously developing capabilities within Azure on the networking layers, the compute layers, within their platform services, and everything that they're building into the Azure today.
Very cool. Sounds impressive. So that was a mouthful.
Absolutely.
So what resources are available to customers to kind of help them walk through this whole Azure security journey?
Sure. I mentioned a few of them. There's a trust center and a trust portal that contains a lot of this documentation and material. That's where they're providing a lot of the transparency that they have against their audits and controls statements that they build Azure against, and that's what they operate to. So they're giving that to us, the consumers, to build our programs on top of that. There's a lot of good material out on Channel 9 within the videos. One I'll call out is a recent keynote by Brad Anderson at Ignite this past year that's really good for a starting point to understand Azure security. There's also the docs.microsoft.com platform. They've got a lot of material out there that they've been building recently to help build the security platform in general. There's certain design aspects to it as well. So they're creating templates that we can use and consume, that we can have a starting point that are built inherently on the security that they are recommending, the best practices that go against that. So there's some really good material around that, as well as some onboarding and enterprise strategy guides that they're building too to help us guide us along the way.
Very cool. Thank you. So moving on to Shannon, she's our infrastructure guru. So how do customers implement Azure infrastructure securely?
Sure, so we actually get this question quite a bit. As it relates to our engagements, we try to have the networking conversations outright, just because of the fact it's easier to implement it outright versus down the road. Once you've deployed more of your compute layers and more of your resource-intensive workloads, we want to make sure that the network layer is the first foundational layer that gets kind of installed or implemented. So we try to go the route of starting with networking. Then we'll look at things like identity, and we'll also look at things from like a monitoring perspective. So we try and start with those three facets, but there's a ton of different ways you can secure the infrastructure inside Azure as it stands. So even though Microsoft themselves, they've invested heavily in the cloud infrastructure as it stands, what they really want is they want customers to take into consideration a multi-layered approach. Mm-hmm. So there's a certain shared responsibility with maintaining the security posture for the firm. On top of it, kind of a good starting point is to start with this zero trust model from a networking perspective. The idea that it's never trust, always verify. So that's really kind of the nature that Microsoft has gone the route of encouraging customers to adopt Azure.
So in terms of the network itself, what sort of characteristics or features does it have?
Sure. So, the virtual networks themselves are essentially the foundation of the way that Azure gets deployed. So the virtual network itself is an isolated network. So by default, there's a lot of things that are turned off. If you want to turn them on, you can do so by configuring NSGs. You can configure certain types of, and I can go into that in a second. It's one of those things where you'll go the route of starting with the VNet, starting to think about the topology, think about the ways that your workloads need to communicate in Azure, as well as externally. So just so that you understand the perimeter of your network and understand the production workloads as well, so that you've understood that, okay, we've got different layers of security from kind of the perimeter zone on into what's happening on a production level. So each virtual network carries the following kind of features and characteristics. We've got the traffic isolation, so what I had talked about earlier, in the sense that everything that's initially deployed to a VNet is isolated unless you explicitly allow certain things to communicate. So by default, when you spin up a virtual machine and say you spin it up and you've got 3 different subnets inside one VNet, those virtual machines will still be able to talk to each other even though they're on different subnets. So that's one cool thing. You can go the route of going an extra layer and actually denying and explicitly stating, okay, this VM can only talk to these VMs in this specific network subnet. So from there, we've got kind of the multi-tier topology, the idea that if you've got specific workloads. Let's just say you deploy SharePoint, for instance, into Azure. It's comprised of a number of different VM server roles, so you've got the capacity to isolate all of those servers in one specific subnet so that they can't essentially talk to anything else, or one specific VNet. So you've got the idea that you can go the route of capturing everything in one specific VNet. So that's one way of thinking it through. You've got the notion of cross-premises connectivity. So the way that you think through hybrid connectivity is a couple of different ways. There's VPNs, so there's point to site, there's site to site. And then you've got express route. So the VPN connectivity happens over the public internet. It's encrypted. It's a tunnel that essentially is established on both ends, so that you understand that it's communication that is encrypted and can happen between your on-prem infrastructure and your Azure infrastructure. On top of it, express route is a dedicated circuit. So it's one of those things where you can set it up with private peering. You can set it up with public peering. There's so many different flexible ways you can think through structuring out what can talk to what in terms of Azure. From there, we can talk through the notion of network security groups, or NSGs, as I talked about a little bit earlier. It's essentially an ACL list, right? So you get to control what's happening from an egress and an ingress perspective, so that you don't have something out there communicating and it shouldn't be, right? So you can really protect things from like that layered perspective. We've got the notion of user-defined routes. So this allows kind of customers to define paths between different tiers of a virtual network. So they can deploy a firewall or an IDS or an IPS solution, and you can essentially define the way that communication goes into and out of the network, so that in the event that you've got a really secure application or a really secure workload, you've got ways to control what actually communicates to the outside world. From there, you can also think through things like network virtual appliances, security appliances like firewalls, for instance, or load balancers in the actual Azure marketplace. You can actually deploy those and kind of really control what your network is doing by different layers. So sometimes those appliances offer up different features than, say, the Azure native type features. So it's something to take into consideration as the virtual network gets deployed.
So you talked about identity management. So how can customers restrict access to certain resources from like an authentication perspective?
Sure. So Azure Active Directory has RBAC built in, so role-based access control. What you can do is you can explicitly define user identities prior to somebody logging in. So Microsoft really is applying the same standards of RBAC on-prem into RBAC in the cloud. The idea that administrators are really only allowing users to do what they need to do, and that's it. So that's one way of thinking it through. Additionally, you can go the route of implementing multi-factor authentication. So you've got a two-way verification process in order to allow somebody to come into the network and actually use your Azure resources.
And how is that different from, say, the Active Directory that most people know. So how is Azure AD different from the AD in the traditional sense?
Sure.
Is it just that it's living in the cloud, or?
It's a little bit different. So
Right.
the whole notion here is, you don't have things like Kerberos, you don't have things like LDAP queries. It's a flatter topology for identity management versus the on-prem world where you've got Kerberos issuing out tickets to users who are logging in. So you don't really have that in Azure right now. You've got it by way of Azure AD as a service, but that's still kind of new and in its infancy. So it's a flatter way of providing identity management, and then it's one of those things too. It's really geared towards those cloud applications, those SaaS applications where somebody just needs to log into a portal, for instance, and then they can do whatever they need to do. The cool thing is you can hook it back into your on-prem Active Directory. So by way of directory synchronization, you can take care of transferring those identities that live on-prem in your on-prem AD infrastructure, and you can transfer them into Azure AD so that your end users, for instance, if they're logging into Azure resources, they don't have to worry about an additional password, for instance. Yeah.
Build a hybrid nature. You
Yeah.
can also build on top of it. We're building a lot of consumer-based identity solutions as well that integrate right directly into that.
Very cool. So you talked about identity management. What about monitoring? So how can a customer monitor securely inside their Azure subscription?
This changes so frequently. I was just talking to Mark prior to filming. This is one of those areas that changes so quickly. So there's a couple of different ways. You've got the Security Center, which is a newer feature. You can essentially see your real-time security posture down to the individual resource. So you can see when you're missing patches, for instance. You can see when certain vulnerabilities are exposed, and you can detect it almost in real time and start to respond to those vulnerabilities. The cool thing is you can actually set up alerts, and you can actually go in and see kind of dashboards. So you can get an understanding of the vulnerabilities that exist in your network and apply those recommendations. So it's kind of one of those things where it's a proactive way of taking a look at kind of the idea that you could potentially be breached. So Microsoft knows you can't prevent all breaches, but it's the idea of how quickly can you identify and remediate in the event that something gets through.
Responding.
Correct. And then Operations Management Suite has a couple of different features as well. There's the security and auditing and the security and compliance. They're kind of similar, but also kind of different, as we've discovered. So the auditing is more so dealing with those log files that get generated inside of your subscription. So you can kind of see what's happening to your resources in real time, what's happening to those IaaS VMs, what's happening to those PaaS instances, so you're not sitting there in an exposed position. And then from there, the security and compliance, somewhat similar. I feel at some point maybe it's going to kind of blend into all kind of three. I guess we'll see what happens, but yeah, so you get the same kind of features where you're able to see the real-time health of your infrastructure, and if there's any vulnerabilities that are exposed, you get capacity to go the route of actually remediating them based upon dashboards that you'll essentially set up and alerting.
Nice. It's pretty impressive. You mentioned security and compliance onto Ryan here. So say I'm a client. How is this going to affect my existing compliance and security programs that I've already got in place?
Yeah, so what we typically find is that when customers are looking at the cloud, they kind of have the same basic concerns that they had on premises. So the first is really around data security and making sure that their data is secure and they understand the implications of what storing data in the cloud has. The second is around data privacy and making sure that their data is kept private and they know where it's stored. The third is around data control and making sure that their data is not going to be released to a government agency without proper process and control. The fourth is around transparency and making sure that they have the ability to independently audit and verify the processes that are used to maintain their security. And finally, the last is around maintaining compliance. So as needs in governance or certifications change, having the ability to make sure that they know that their cloud service provider or Microsoft is going to be flexible and keep up with that. So Microsoft has a wealth of services to really kind of address those basic concerns. So and what we find is that when customers start to look at Microsoft's security, it's world class, like what Mark was saying, and all the effort and investment that they're making into making sure that they're secure. But what we find is that customers typically, by moving to the cloud, end up, probably having a better security stance in the cloud because just the investment Microsoft's making,
Right.
it's more than they could ever do on their
Yeah,
own.
that seems pretty difficult to try to replicate in-house there.
Definitely. So the good news is for customers is that depending on the services that you're using, a lot of infrastructure inside of Azure can be treated in a very similar way from a security perspective. But one of the big differences in comparing on-premises infrastructure and cloud infrastructure is the concept of shared responsibility. And all cloud service providers kind of operate on the premise of shared responsibility. And what that actually means is that Microsoft will have responsibility in managing and securing that infrastructure. But you also have responsibility in managing and securing that infrastructure as well. And really the amount of that shared responsibility varies depending on the type of infrastructure that you're deploying, whether that's IaaS or PaaS or even software as a service. But really, let's walk through an example here, right? So let's say I'm a customer today and I'm on-prem and I've got all my workloads in my own data center. So step one is really to start to reevaluate all of your controls, all of your security controls, to understand where there's shared responsibility, right? So that's step one in trying to identify where that shared responsibility is and all the critical factors that you need to consider when thinking about your workloads in the cloud. One resource that we typically recommend to customers to start with is the Cloud Security Alliance. They have a document that they publish. It's the Cloud Control Matrix. So if you're not familiar with the Cloud Security Alliance, it's a not-for-profit alliance, and they're really about promoting best practices and security assurance within cloud computing. So the Cloud Control Matrix, or the CCM, it is a common set of controls and control details that you can basically use to understand cloud-specific risks. So they actually give recommendations by resource domain. So they've got 13 different domains inside of the Cloud Control Matrix. And it's the kind of the typical stuff that you would always think about with security. It's access control, it's identity management, it's network security, it's change management, so on and so forth. But basically, by all the controls in those different domains, they basically map those back to kind of all of the major compliance and certification frameworks, things like FedRAMP or NIST or ISO or PCI compliance. So really the biggest benefit of using the Cloud Control Matrix is it really gives you a framework to make sure that you consider all of the important factors when looking at moving workloads to the cloud. And that's a really huge benefit because the cloud is complex, right? All of this stuff that we just talked about, making sure that you would consider all those important factors is critical to security in the cloud.
Definitely.
Another great thing about the Cloud Control Matrix is that Microsoft has already provided commentary on how their security controls inside of Azure satisfy the recommendations in the Cloud Control Matrix. So that's a great resource that Microsoft's already helped you identify where they fit and how they satisfy that requirement.
Yeah, I can imagine that would take a lot of work out of the process. But so you listed quite a few tools. What are some other tools to really help companies align with their existing security and compliance programs?
Yeah, so Mark mentioned the Service Trust Portal, and Microsoft just recently released an Azure Cloud Risk Assessment tool inside of the Service Trust Portal. And so basically what that risk assessment tool does is it's broken out again by domain. So there's 19 domains. And what they've done is they've basically pre-populated how Azure complies from a security perspective to controls in those 19 domains. So again, what they've done is they've taken all of these certification and frameworks and kind of created these Uber controls that, it's kind of the commonality across all those frameworks, and then basically shown how Azure security maps. Now the great thing about this tool is it starts to break down the shared responsibility by control. So that's, again, step one was to figure that out. Well, here's a tool which helps you identify it. So the important piece about that is you can see what Microsoft, from a shared responsibility, their scope of responsibility, but more importantly, where your responsibility is as the customer. So again, it's another tool to look at your compliance and security programs and understand the impact of moving workloads to the cloud.
And that shared responsibility is part of the key, because you can get the answers and details from Microsoft and part of what they're providing, but you have to determine how you're going to answer the other half of that picture, right? And that can be a challenge for some to transition from what they have on-prem to the cloud, and where a lot of customers will try to take what they're doing today on-prem and apply it to that shared responsibility model for their slice of the security program, and the challenges become evident. So that's where a lot of this comes from, but benefiting that from the documentation that they've already started, it gives you a starting point so that then you can focus on your part and your component of the puzzle.
Nice. Good old good guy Microsoft throwing this all together for us.
It gives you a place to start, right? I mean, that's the key.
Cool. This has been really insightful. I realized earlier we never cheersed. This is called the Manhattan's Project, after all. Thanks to Koval for the tasty vodka, or whiskey, that is. Clearly I've had a little bit too much. So at this point in the show, we started to play a little game. So I'm going to hand you guys these little paddles. They're actually made from coffee stirrers. And I came up with a little game that I've dubbed Just Bust a Myth, after the Young MC song, Just Bust a Move. So you each have your paddles. They're labeled myth and fact. And I'm going to ask you 5 questions. And whoever gets the most right at the end of the game wins a fancy 10th magnitude mug.
Fancy.
With some dark matter coffee.
Ooh, yummy.
All right.
What if we get them all wrong?
Then
you get
you're
nothing.
fired.
Pressure's on.
It's all right.
So I see that you're kind of like peeking over here. So. All right, so a lot of these are going to be security related questions. We're going to, include a couple pop culture ones in here. So myth or fact? The Yahoo breach in December 2016 was the largest data breach in history to date. Myth or fact? All right, you all got that right. So yeah, that was in fact the largest data breach to date, and it compromised the personal information of just about 1 billion Yahoo accounts. So, all right, in the 1995 movie Hackers, starring Angelina Jolie and Johnny Lee Miller, this has the lowest score recorded on the movie review website Rotten Tomatoes. Myth or fact? That is a myth. The movie, while it did score a pathetic 32% on Rotten Tomatoes, there are other movies that take the cake at 0%, one of them being Joe Dirt 2, Beautiful Loser. All right, so you guys keeping track of your scores here? I'm not. So the computer worm I Love You was one of the most destructive viruses in history, originated in the Philippines. Myth or fact? That is a fact. Over 50 million infections were reported in 2000, compromising an estimated 10% of internet-connected computers in the world, which is insane. So, myth or fact? Most cyber criminals don't target small businesses because the payout is bigger with larger companies. Myth or fact? A lot of people say that's a myth. So the Target breach in 2014 was actually traced back to network credentials that were stolen from a third-party small business HVAC vendor. So through that vendor, they were able to snag those security credentials. And last question, myth or fact, the most common password used by the public last year was, quote, password. It's actually a myth. According to the company Keeper, the most common
the opposite.
password in 2016 was 123456.
It's on my luggage.
Yes,
Password
me
1, 2,
too.
3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
Maybe
So let's see.
So I missed 2.
I clearly did win.
I missed 2 as well. We have a tie.
Uh-oh.
Oh no, we do have a
Split.
tie.
Do you
Now they have to
tiebreaker?
drink coffee together out of the
Yeah.
same
Yeah,
mug.
well,
You
we've
know
had.
what?
Out of the same mug. That's perfect.
Yeah. Well, let's let Shannon have it.
That's very special.
Yeah, well, we've got more than enough left over from the holidays, so
We all win.
yeah, we all get
Hey,
mugs.
everyone wins.
Mugs for everyone.
Yeah, but no, this has been great. Thank you again for joining us today. Feel free to follow us on Twitter at 10th Magnitude and check out our open positions at 10thmagnitude.com/careers. That's all for now, and don't forget, keep calm and cloud on.